Good morning, and welcome back to Highwater Pass, episode 20. I'm a little bit surprised that we've managed to get this far, but, I think it's going pretty good. The zoo is nearly done. I think there's maybe 1 or 2 more episodes left, and then after that we're going to move on. So, right now on screen, I'm adding in the Baird's tapir, and then shortly after that I'll be adding in the giant anteater. Right now I'm doing a whole bunch of fiddling. I'm just going to warn you guys, this particular episode, for whatever reason, it was a bit of a pain to film, it was a little bit of a pain to edit, and it's now been a bit of a pain to do the voiceover for. I had this entire script written for it, and apparently I just miscalculated how long everything takes. So, at this point I know the information pretty well. I'm just gonna go as we build this, build these different habitats. It's definitely gonna be a chaotic episode, unfortunately. So right now, I'm making all of these different adjustments with the assumption that the Baird's tapir are going to be able to fit in this area only. That doesn't actually end up being true. I think when we're done, this does look pretty good, and I'm glad that I did the little tweaks that I did, but we are actually going to expand them into the anteater habitat. This is for a couple of reasons. Number one, they just don't have enough space in there. There's no way to get the water in and have them have enough land space, and we're backed up right onto the corner of the world right there. And if we go any farther, we're going to have to either move the Everglades Emporium, or we're going to have to, dig into the alligator exhibit, so I'm not particularly keen on that. So, we're doing a little bit of terraforming, and then those two will get open. So as for our standard facts, the Baird's tapir is actually one of 4 different tapirs. Or at least 4 different extant tapirs, which means that they still exist. There used to be multiple species of tapir living in prehistory. However, most of them have gone extinct. And in fact, the majority of tapir species that used to exist actually lived primarily in North America, with a handful living in Europe, eventually migrating down into Asia, and then moving over to the Malaysian Islands, which is actually how we get the Malaysian tapir, also represented in Planet Zoo. The Baird's tapir, as well as the other 2 species of tapir that we still have, only live in South America. And this is because, again, as the Northern Hemisphere species died out, these were the ones that were left. Along with them, we also have the giant anteater. And again, there are 4 different species of anteater, although it's not proper to say that. Actually, there's 2 species of Commandua and 2 species of anteater that are generally recognized within their same family. The giant anteater happens to be the largest, and it's also the only one that is limited to ground. The majority of anteaters actually live in trees and live a semi-arboreal life. The Baird's tapir, and really any tapir, has really never left the forests. In fact, they've been the way that they are for so long that archaeologists actually use them to measure where different prehistoric forests grew and died out. The anteater, on the other hand, went down a very different evolutionary path. They evolved primarily to eat ants, but also other insects. They use their gigantic claws in order to rip open these termite mounds like the one that I've placed in the zoo, or to rip open rotting trees and be able to eat the insects on the inside. It's a very different ecological niches, but both very important to ecosystems and the ecological health in their respective areas in South America. This habitat, I wanted to go fairly simple with it. These animals don't necessarily share a lot of the same forest and tree requirements. They want a decent amount of foliage, but the Baird's tapir would really prefer to live in forests, and the anteaters prefer to live more in grasslands, although they will merge into the edge of forests. So to compensate, I've done a little bit of a mixture. So it's lightly treed, and then we've also got this water area, which is required for the Baird's tapir. But we've also got fairly open spaces to accommodate the anteaters. As we do this, I'm actually going to be working on the Cuvier dwarf caimans exhibit at the same time. When I first started working on this area, I had some plans in mind, but unfortunately they didn't work out. After the redecorating, I realized that neither the alligator nor the caiman actually had enough room, and that they will not cohab with each other. The caiman also will not cohab with the jaguar either, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. As for the alligators, they're one of the largest species on the continent, if not the largest species in North America. They are also our most common crocodilian, especially in the American South. If you live in Florida or Louisiana, it's best to assume that they are living in every fresh body of water. In fact, it's pretty normal in Florida to net over below-ground pools for exactly this reason. We actually had personal experience with this. It wasn't an alligator, thankfully, but rather a snapping turtle, and it managed to get into our pool just after my mom had shocked it with chlorine. Thankfully, she was able to rescue the turtle and take it to a nearby lake less than a mile from our house. And thankfully also, neither she nor the turtle were harmed. Florida has a lot of reptiles. Many are invasive, however the alligator is not only a native reptile but also a cultural symbol. However, this is not always positive, since they pose a clear and present danger, primarily because they're more ubiquitous than, say, the Florida puma. You probably already know of the football team, but tourist traps like to sell a lot of gator-related paraphernalia, and that includes gator heads, both real and fake, as well as gator tail for consumption. This can be a bit of a shock to people from outside the state, but again, it all comes from how ubiquitous the animals are. These particular animals in question are farmed. However, they are important enough that we recognize the seasons by their habits. Because Florida is so tropical, we don't have normal seasons. Instead, we classify the year via hurricane season, love bug season, and of course, alligator mating season. This time of the year is particularly dangerous since the gators leave their home lakes and rivers to migrate, during which time they are highly aggressive and tend to cross traffic at all times of the day. Because many gators grow to well over 9 feet long, this becomes a problem for pedestrians and motorists alike for about 3 to 4 months out of the year. Essentially, if you're planning to move to Florida, I strongly recommend that you study up on these animals because they will dictate a surprising amount of your daily life. Caimans, however, are a slightly different matter. They're smaller crocodiliforms that primarily live in South America, and while there are multiple species of crocodiliform that are called caimans, they're not necessarily related. For example, this spectacled caiman that we're adding in is different than the Cuvier's dwarf caiman. There's a couple of different things that set them apart. The first thing, of course, being taxa. The Cuvier's dwarf caiman and the spectacled caiman, while they're fairly close on the family tree to each other, they're not actually related sister taxa. They're separate by a couple million years. The spectacled caiman specifically gets its name for the ridges that have developed along its eyes, which the researcher who discovered them felt that they looked a little bit more like glasses. And of course, the Cuvier's dwarf caiman is the smallest crocodiliform that we know of. The spectacled caiman is significantly larger. At this point, we're going to move on to the Jaguars, and this seems a little bit abrupt, but I move on quickly, partially because that's what's going on screen, and partially because, again, I am going to attempt to merge the Cuvier's dwarf caiman and the Jaguar habitat, because as you could see right there, this entire habitat is completely escapable. I mentioned that it might be escapable when I built it. I was regrettably extremely right. Here I have the attempt to merge these two habitats. I'm adjusting the fence right there. But as we will see, the jaguar and the caiman do not cohabitate under any circumstances. In fact, this is incredibly true to real life. Jaguars are one of the only animals that are capable of taking down crocodiles, which is one of the reasons why caimans like the Cuvier's dwarf and the spectacled are not considered apex predators in their biomes. Jaguars instead form the vast majority of their predation, and it has to do with the way that jaguars hunt. Most animals will attempt to go for some kind of bite that results in oxygen deprivation. Jaguars instead attempt to crush the skull. This is a significantly more brutal method of hunting, as I'm sure you can probably tell, but it's also significantly more successful for the areas that they live in. Jaguars primarily live in forests and near swamps, and these heavily wooded areas allow for the jaguar to have plenty of arboreal roaming space, which of course, being cats, they're primarily arboreal hunters. Indeed, they fill a similar niche to the leopard, the African leopard specifically. We have a melanistic jaguar in our habitat because, of course, who doesn't want to have a black jaguar? However, the standard form, the non-melanistic form, is nearly identical visually to the African leopard. For the longest time when I was a kid, I wondered why. I assumed that they were the same species living in two different places of the world, garnering two different names. This is not actually true, and this may be old news to you. You know, it may have been fairly evident, but for me it was not. It sort of led me down a research rabbit hole to figure out why they look almost identical when they're clearly not the same creature. And it turns out it's a case of convergent evolution. Now, jaguars and leopards are both members of the Pantherinae family, which is, you know, the large majority of big cats fall into Pantherinae. That's, you know, your lions and virtually all of your leopards. We'll talk about an exception in a moment here. So, this means that these two animals are fairly related to each other, but they're not directly related. And there's, you know, several million years of separation between the two species, never mind two different continents and an ocean. What's actually caused their look to become similar is that both of them inhabit roughly identical niches within their habitats, despite their habitats being very different places. The African leopard lives primarily on the savanna, and while it is an arboreal hunter, it drags its prey up into trees, etc., it does not necessarily spend all that time in the trees. You know, most of its home is African grassland, which means a lot of oranges and yellows and browns, which means that its patterning makes it very easy to blend into both the grasslands and into the canopies of the trees where they live. Jaguars form a similar niche. They live primarily in the canopies of the trees, but they will come down, you know, when it's required. In fact, actually, jaguars and tigers actually have quite a bit in common as well, namely because of the way that their coloration works to help to camouflage them. You would think that, you know, with the fact that the tree canopy being bright green, and the vast majority of their habitat being lush, that being, you know, super yellow or super orange would be a detriment and not a benefit. But because of the way that the light hits their coats and diffuses that light, it actually creates a camouflaging effect. It makes it more difficult for the prey to figure out what exactly they're looking at before it can pounce on them. In other words, we have convergent evolution creating identical situations for both of these animals, despite the fact that they live in completely different parts of the world, completely different habitats. It's fairly interesting stuff. So, regrettably, this entire section of the habitat, as you can tell, I was having a lot of difficulties with it. This is going to go on for a little while longer, and right here you can see that I'm fixing up the border between our clouded leopards and our jaguars. Indeed, sir. Things are going to get a little bit messy from here. So, at the current moment, as I go ahead and fix this up, I want to give you guys a little bit of a sneak peek as to what we're going to be doing in the future. At this point, I've completed the zoo, and it is actually uploaded to Steam, it's just not made public yet. However, when the last episode goes up, I will be making it public for you to download. And everybody say hi to Ollie, my personal leopard, because he has decided that I cannot be left alone to talk. He is a tuxedo cat. If I can get some pictures of him on screen, I think I will. He's very aggressive in his love. Right now it's like 7 in the morning, and he's decided that because my husband's gone to work, he needs to be held for emotional support, which is very sweet, but also a little bit of a detrimental impact to recording. Anyway, what I was saying is that when the zoo is completely done, I'll be unlocking that download for Steam. So if you want to play on this zoo for yourself, you're more than welcome to. I don't know that all of this is going to be acceptable for franchise mode, but you can certainly give it a shot if you would rather just do the management part of the sim rather than having to build it yourself. You know, that's perfectly understandable. The main things that might cause some problems are going to be the buffalo habitat. For their welfare, you may need to change that up a little bit just because of the issues that I had with it back in the previous episode, trying to get everything to work. But it should be fairly acceptable. I tried to build to the specific requirements of the animals rather than pure fantasy, you know. But after the series is done, I mentioned that we're going to have 2 different series previously. So what we're looking at right now is that as of recording today, and as of when this episode goes up tomorrow, we just had the Arid Pack announced. And I'm very excited for this, but it also gives me a bit of a problem because our second zoo was actually going to be that Journey to the West zoo that I mentioned in the overview for the Tropical Pack. It's currently in progress. It's not a terribly large roster of animals that I have to work on, but the project itself is rather expansive because, I'm recreating scenes from Journey to the West to the best of my abilities, having not been able to actually read the book. I've also had some minor issues recording it, a lot of corrupted footage, things like that. So that series will be coming, but it may not necessarily be as, what's the word for this? Regular. It may not necessarily be a regular series, it may just be whenever I can get it uploaded. I am currently working on stuff for the Arid pack. I do not own the pack at this point. This channel is way too small for me to be considered for a sneak preview of that pack. However, the vast majority of the animals are African, and I've done enough building in this game to know roughly what their requirements are going to be, because eventually you realize that all of them are fairly standardized, Hoofstock have roughly the same amount of space requirements, so do the small cats, and, all of that kind of stuff. So I am working on that. Hopefully I will be able to get that edited and uploaded and voiced over and all that kind of stuff. Of course, my editor is going to have to okay the project. Since they just graduated college, they're sort of in a weird place right now. Oh, we're finally hitting the clouded leopard, good. But yeah, so that's a possibility of something that's coming to the channel. And then, of course, our next main series is going to be Big Bear Bend. We're going to try and get every bear in the game into one singular park. That one's going to be a combination of building and animal habitats. So I've already got 3 episodes, maybe 4 episodes done. I've added in the polar bears, I've added in a salmon fishery or a salmon museum kind of thing. We are not going to stay over here right now, we're going to move back to the leopards. This is just a bit of organizing. But that's definitely going to be coming pretty quick here. So, just a little bit of a sneak preview while I get all the management done. So, we're finally onto the clouded leopards. This was honestly one of my favorite habitats to build for, but it was also, like all of these, a little bit frustrating. This whole South American area, well, it looks very pretty, at least to me. There have been some frustrations with it, as I'm sure you can tell. The clouded leopard had the least problems, by far. I was very happy with the fact that he could climb all over this sort of, like, expedition tent area. I end up using those aquatic rocks to make sure that he can't jump down. They were actually a lifesaver for a couple of animals. Because they're so rough and bumpy, some animals can't walk over them, and then of course some cats, like these two, can't jump onto them, which is very helpful. I did mention, while talking about our Jaguars over there, that there are some big cats that are kind of sort of Pantherinae, kind of sort of not. This was referring to the clouded leopard. This is actually one of the oldest extant lineages of cat, period, in the entire world. They're very old, and they actually branched off from the main Pantherinae family a long while ago. I don't have numbers, but very long ago. Before most of the other panthers that you think of. So before snow leopards, before, jaguars and African leopards, before all of those branched off. So a very ancient species. But this has also resulted in a few quirks. You can probably tell from their patterning that their patterning is very unusual. This is partially because of their habitat. They're extremely arboreal, even more than some of the other cats that we're going to talk about or have talked about. And we'll talk about some of the adaptations about that in a bit, but that has also resulted in this very unique patterning and coloring. Because of the habitat that they live in, they have different light patterns that they need to diffuse, and so it's resulted in this different pattern that has nothing to do with stripes or spots. It's very unique. They do, of course, live in Southeast Asia. They were part of the Southeast Asia pack when this was released to the game. They are considered vulnerable by the ICUN. And unfortunately, as much as that pattern and that coat helps them to blend into their surroundings, it unfortunately makes them very appealing to poachers, which is why they've ended up in the vulnerable status. There are also some issues with traditional medicine, which is, unfortunately fairly normal for a lot of big cats, or really anything that lives in Asia. However, the main issue is, of course, that poaching for their pelts. However, I mentioned that they also have several adaptations that make them unusually good at living in the trees in a way that other cats just don't really have. And for their part, one of the things is actually that, and ignore this part, I realized that I tried to do this a couple of months ago, and now I've got a whole bunch of animals piled up. It's fine, don't worry about it. but that the clouded leopards have ankle bones that are unusually flexible. It allows them to cling to trees extremely well and to be able to have a lot of navigation. So, a few interesting adaptations there. So let's talk about this part, now that we're finally on to the proper foxes, and right now, this is going to be prairie dogs. However, the prairie dogs are actually going to get moved. This is not going to stay their habitat. I realized after doing the terraforming that it really didn't blend in well with this area, and they weren't particularly happy. I also realized that in the intervening months, we'd gotten an animal that's actually better for this area than the prairie dogs are. I'm actually going to be replacing them with armadillos very shortly. Additionally, for this area, I'd originally intended fennec foxes, but of course we got the twilight pack in the intervening years, and the red fox is a much better suited animal for these areas. I'm a little bit disappointed with their terrain requirements because they live in a wide variety of areas, but the game doesn't necessarily reflect that flexibility in their terrain requirements. They do live in deserts, specifically bordering along, I believe, the Mojave. However, the game wants you to have a certain percentage of dirt, and a certain percentage of grass, and a certain percentage of all these different things. So I tried my best to make this look like it fits in with the general area. Unfortunately, this means that we're not going to be able to have this as a walkthrough habitat either, so this cave ends up getting edited, and then this walkthrough gate ends up getting closed off. However, I think the viewing area, especially once we add in this exhibit animal, is just fine. You can see into the cave fairly clearly. I'm quite happy with that. So, foxes are easily one of my favorite animals, but I don't want to spend too long talking about them, namely because our time is almost done, but also because, honestly, you've probably heard most of the facts about foxes, you know. That magnetic compass that they seem to have allows them to be unusually good hunters. And of course, there is the project to domesticate the fox, which is very interesting, and I highly recommend looking into it. It's actually been one of the major things that's helped us unravel some of the mysteries around domestication and how it relates to genetics. So foxes have been integral to our understanding of that science. prairie dogs to this area, as well as adding in a couple new animals. I end up building this sign that says Maine and Isa instead of Asia. My editor pointed out that I had a bit of a dyslexic moment. Unfortunately, again, the zoo is already uploaded to Steam, so I am not going to be fixing that. I'm sorry to all the people that that's going to anger. But I am fully aware that it is a mistake, and I apologize. So, we're also going to be adding in striped skunks and armadillos. Sorry, striped skunks and raccoons. And at this point, I'm adding in the armadillos. The habitat actually ended up translating extremely well. I literally just changed some of the terraforming, and that was all I needed to do. This area is virtually perfect for them, and they are in fact walk-through animals. Armadillos are particularly interesting animals because of their low body temperature. They're a lot like bats in that way. They're mostly native to the American Southeast, and while they're currently limited to as far north as Virginia, they are projected to actually migrate into as north as Pennsylvania due to global warming. They're actually one of the few animals that might end up benefiting from the global warming. It's a very short list, but they might be on it, which is very interesting. I also had some issues with some escapes, but we'll get that fixed up. They are also known to carry diseases because of that low body temperature. One of the things that you've probably heard is that armadillos can carry leprosy. This is absolutely true. You should not handle a wild armadillo. And while it is also true that it's very unlikely that you will contract leprosy, it does not change the fact that you do not want that disease. And likewise, do not Google what that is unless you have an extremely strong stomach. It is not fun in any particular way. You may also have heard that armadillos can roll up into a ball. This is true for the 3-banded armadillo, but that is not the species represented in game. In fact, the 9-banded armadillo's method of defense is actually to jump straight up into the air, which is both humorous but also a little bit dangerous because it's the primary way that they get hit by cars. They're actually short enough that they should be able to just pass underneath one. Unfortunately, they have that startle reflex, and that does help to protect them from predators. It helps them jump out and keep away from potentially being eaten, but it does come to a detriment. We're back over here with a clouded leopard. And the main reason we're over here again is because, for some reason, the last couple of updates, we've had a lot of issues with trees not registering as climbable objects for certain animals. I'm not entirely sure why. I don't know if this is something intentional or if this is an issue that they didn't realize was in the game. So hopefully they'll get that cleared up. But in the meantime, I end up working on some climbing areas for them, a bit like we did for the Jaguar. These end up turning out okay-ish, but it's a little bit frustrating. I didn't mean to have this be so jumpy, but again, this was sort of a difficult episode because there was so much management going on in the background. We were talking last time about how clouded leopards are particularly adapted to the trees. This is another case where this is sort of shown off. They need a lot of climbing space, and they're particularly adapted to it, again with those ankle bones, but then also with the way that they're able to grip onto branches and keep themselves steady while sleeping. They do also enjoy different hammocks, so a lot of this needs to be accommodated when they're in captivity. Over here, we are going to start working on adding in a new exhibit. This is the exhibit for the skunks and the raccoons that I mentioned earlier. Again, it didn't feel right to have a North American zoo without including these two animals, as they're basically staples of our wildlife. They're iconic for us. Both skunks and raccoons have found purchase on other continents. However, for the most part, this is cases of being imported, not that these are their natural habitats. Raccoons are known for a few things. Obviously, both raccoons and skunks, people have attempted to keep them as pets. I cannot recommend this, but for very different reasons. Raccoons specifically, they have an extremely developed sense of touch, and they also have an extremely developed kind of intelligence. It's not the same intelligence that we humans experience, but it is an intelligence nonetheless. And these two things work in tandem. Raccoons, you may have heard, tend to wash their food. There's actually videos on the internet of them attempting to wash cotton candy and then being upset when it disappears, which is very humorous but also terribly cruel. I can't believe they would do that to something so innocent. It is very humorous. However, it is important to note that this washing behavior is a sign of their tactile requirements, their intelligence, but it's also something that only appears in captive populations. It is not something that appears in naturally occurring populations, and it has to do with the way that they hunt. So raccoons live, of course, all across North America and into different other regions as well. I believe there's a population in Japan and Europe. However, for the most part, they prefer wetlands, and they will hunt for food and forage along the borders of streams and lakes and things like that. They have these incredibly tough paw pads that are also very sensitive. They have vibrissae on their paw pads, which is unusual. Vibrissae, if you haven't heard of those, is essentially cat whiskers, except that, instead of being on their face, they're on their paws. The technical term for that is vibrissae. When submerged in water, their paw pads soften up, a lot like our, hands do. Instead of getting grippy, theirs get softer, and it allows for them to have a better sense of touch. And this sense of touch is the primary sense of how they interact with the world. They have decently okay eyesight. They have extremely good hearing. I've heard that supposedly that they can hear earthworms burrowing underground, but I only found that on one source, so it may be possible that that's a over-exaggeration. But since that sense of touch is their primary way of understanding the world, they've also developed an intelligence to go along with it. For example, raccoons can basically remember any pattern that they learn how to solve for the next 3 years, and they're extremely good at solving things like locks and puzzles. So they have an extremely pronounced understanding and intelligence for different ways to manipulate their terrain and their environment. This doesn't necessarily translate to the same kind of intelligence that we have. And it's important to understand that there is always going to be that difference between us, but there's also some similarities. As far as skunks go, it's actually incredibly difficult to find any sort of facts about skunks that doesn't relate to their stench, which I was rather disappointed about. I'd hoped that there was something more to them, but unfortunately this is the thing that we hyperfixate on. So if we're going to hyperfixate on it, let's really talk about it. So skunks, again, the primary use of that smell is, of course, defense. They have a gland near their butt that produces the mucus that causes that spray, and it's full of different sulfuric compounds. This means that when they spray you, it can also cause a burning sensation. One of my first questions when I started looking into this was, do skunks know how bad they smell? And it turns out that actually, yes, they're keenly aware, and they know how to use that as a weapon, which I found very interesting and very self-aware of them. And then my next question was, does that smell bother them? Because, it bothers the rest of us, and you would think that some smells are just so horrible that, it would bother everybody. The answer is probably not, because of the fact that they're born with it, they grow up with it, they probably get used to it. But it definitely bothers them when another skunk sprays them. So they're used to their own smell, but they're not used to another skunk's, which I found very interesting. At this point, we are moving on to our last animal of the video. We're moving on to the groundhogs. Again, these are sort of a staple animal. It makes it very difficult to talk about them because there's not a lot that I can say about groundhogs that, a certain portion of the population don't already know by heart. The main problem is that for the majority of Americans who farm, groundhogs are actually a huge detriment to crops. They're also huge harbingers of disease, unfortunately. So most farmers will attempt to exterminate them as pests rather than let them set up house. But there is a whole lot more to groundhogs that doesn't just relate to the crop damage they cause. In fact, there is evidence and a significant portion of research, which I will add below, that indicates that groundhogs have something akin to language. And I know that that's a very bold claim. We don't like to believe that anything but humans are capable of language. It's a very, anthropomorphic thing to declare that they have any kind of understanding of the world. But what they do have is a series of calls, an adaptive language of calls. There's no other word I can think of for it, that indicate things like there's a coyote versus there's a hawk. There's a generic word for thing. There's a lot of different chirps that mean specific things that the entire colony will learn in order for it to have that as protection. They rotate out their different guards, and so they all have to have this different system so that way, the ones who are burrowing or foraging can all hide whenever a predator approaches. Well, researchers at one of the universities in Arizona decided to study their local groundhog colony to see if there was any way to understand these chirps and to potentially affect them. And the answer was a resounding yes. And we are coming up to the end of the video. This is about to cut off. But I'm going to go ahead and keep talking, and hopefully we'll put something here. And then, of course, there will be the end screen. But yeah, so it turned out that not only could they decipher the different calls of groundhogs, but they could actually affect them. And that groundhogs could indicate everything from size to color to different species. This is very interesting. And again, I will link all of those different pieces of research in the bottom, in the description below, so that way you can read up on them, because it is a bold statement, but there is quite a lot of evidence to it. So thank you for joining me for this episode. I'm not sure what we're going to be doing next, but, you know, we will, of course, be having a full walkthrough of the zoo. I'm definitely looking forward to that. I'll be attempting to do some kind of narrative and story, as I've kind of indicated throughout this entire process. So, thank you for joining me. I hope you come back for the next episode, and happy Friday!